Welcome to the first episode of the GothCast, GothCast, just know the. But this is Dr. Sanders.
This is Robbie Gore.
Okay, so today on GothCast, the first episode, I thought it would be interesting to take a look at one of the most prolific, maybe not most prolific, but definitely one of the longest lasting, most popular bands associated with Gothic music, and that is The Cure.
You practically can't talk about goth music without bringing up The Cure. But what's ironic about that is The Cure refuses to associate themselves with the Gothic scene.
Yeah, one thing I want to address right off the bat in a podcast that's it's going to be oriented in Gothic subculture, is that especially when we talk about music, a lot of the bands that are, Gothic bands, or you would associate them with Gothic bands, they themselves do not associate with Gothic music. I know Peter Murphy has Bauhaus has talked about how he doesn't really see it as a goth band, or he just thought they were being kind of crazy. But he has also said at other times that he's into Gothic music. And Sisters of Mercy, the Andrew Eldridge says we're not goth, and Robert Smith says we're not goth, and so there's gonna be. We know about the protests of these artists.
Well, I think part of the problem is that I think it's hard to define any genre of music as specifically Gothic.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, even Nick Cave has been labeled goth at certain points in his career.
Oh, yeah.
And I would consider Nick Cave's music pretty far away from goth music in general, necessarily.
Yeah.
I almost feel like goth is a term that applies more towards style than anything else, and I think that's what's most problematic for these bands, is that they don't want to be associated with a style. They are trying to achieve a sound.
Feel limited. Yeah, I could see that, and I think that is one of the main issues with it, because at least a lot of the bands that are longer lasting in Gothic music, they tend to switch it up. Look at Wild Mood Swings with The Cure or something. It's like kind of happier and things like that, and so by that time they kind of tried to move away from the whole dark, broody thing. And
well, I mean, you could even talk about Let's Go to Bed, which was Robert Smith's deliberate attempt to write a pop song just to get away from everything that they had done and everything they've been associated with.
Yeah, exactly. And there's a ton of examples of that. But today we're going to be talking about what we think of the first 4 Cure albums. So that's from Three Imaginary Boys to Pornography. And I thought it was important to kind of focus on. This is a lot of people call it, like the Dark Trilogy or whatever they are. This trilogy of albums, their Gothic rock trilogy, and then Three Imaginary Boys is just their first album. Most people don't even listen to it today.
I think most people haven't even heard of it, to be honest with you.
Yeah, I actually agree with that. Seems like most people in America associate with the Boys Don't Cry release, which adds the song Boys Don't Cry. But a lot of people doesn't seem like are actually familiar with Three Imaginary Boys in its original release. And
I mean, it also stands to say that Three Imaginary Boys doesn't sound like a Cure album.
Yeah. So let's just get right into it. So here's 1979. I mean, it's crazy to think that The Cure was a band from the 70s, right?
Yeah, right.
Yeah. And it's Three Imaginary Boys is a really interesting record, especially in retrospect. Now, do I think it's a bad album? No. Do I think it's a strange album? Yes. And strange, like you could say a lot of The Cure music is really strange. Like you could say that, Pornography is a really strange album. But for The Cure, it's not that strange of an album.
Yeah.
Three Imaginary Boys is a strange album for The Cure.
Well, and I think that's the difference. To say that Three Imaginary Boys is a strange album, maybe a stretch, but to say that it's strange for The Cure makes perfect sense. And I think, by and large, part of the reason for that is that, well, it completely lacks the sound that we associate with The Cure.
Yeah, exactly. They're more... It's hard to even explain. Like, one of the biggest things about this album that is different than their later albums, even the next album, 17 Seconds, is the production of it. It's a very dry production for an album. And almost like in a punk sense, like it's almost the way it's composed, where the songs are very just like... Okay, 4/4, everything is like...
Well, you also have to consider that it's 1979, and they're just coming out of the post-punk existence of the late 70s, and all these bands are writing albums that essentially sound somewhat similar to Three Imaginary Boys, perhaps with more consistency about them.
Yeah. And that's not to say it's not to say there aren't good songs on this album. I mean, there are great songs on this album. A lot of people still know Fire in Cairo. They may not associate it with this album, but they know the song. Subway song is great. I think the one thing that at least is really lacking for me is just the sound of the band together. It doesn't really feel like a whole cohesive unit, and the album itself doesn't feel like a cohesive sound to it. It's because you have songs like Object, they're like sound like super 70s like rock kind of sounding, and you have a cover of Foxy Lady, like Jimi Hendrix's Foxy Lady. Like, a lot of people don't know that The Cure covered Foxy Lady. Like,
well, and that just goes to show you just how little control they had over the record at that point. I don't think anyone would ever imagine in their wildest dreams that The Cure would cover Foxy Lady.
Yep.
And it goes to show, I mean, Robert Smith doesn't sing that song.
Yeah. It's who is it? Michael Dempsey, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Who Robert Smith actually hates.
Yeah. So for this album and this album only, Michael Dempsey was bassist, and most people know obviously Simon Gallup as The Cure's bassist. No, it wasn't. Lowell Tolhurst was played drums on this, I think, and he's in the band for a number of years. But yeah, I think that's one of the reasons that it has a distinctly different sound, because it's so. I feel like he was working within like kind of a guy who was used to playing like classic rock kind of sound.
Exactly. Well, and I also view him as trying, like, being very, I want to say, like, Talking Heads influenced.
I can see
and
that.
I feel like he's playing bass like he's playing for the Talking Heads. And Robert Smith openly talks about how he felt that Dempsey was too ornate for the band. And I mean, you could say that perhaps Dempsey wasn't the right fit for the band, and that contributed perhaps to the fact that that album doesn't have a consistency to it. I mean, I feel like for any band to record a successful album, there has to be a dynamic between the members. And at that point in the band, The Cure wasn't The Cure.
Yeah.
I mean, they were basically still more or less a garage band who had just been signed to a label. And Robert Smith wasn't even sure if he was happy with the lineup. And I think we'll see by the time we get to talking about 17 Seconds that he definitely wasn't happy with the lineup.
Exactly.
Nor the production or many of the things that go on with Three Imaginary Boys.
Yeah. Well, what's your favorite song off of Three Imaginary Boys?
If I have to choose anything that I like off of this record, I'm going to say, like, it's Grinding Halt or Subway Song.
I gotta say, I agree with that. Like, everything's coming to a grinding halt. Like, it sounds great. But then I actually really like Accuracy, and it's just something about that song. Like, it's like a kind of poppy, but kind of just really basic. But I like it a lot.
Well, that's definitely something that's going to be revisited on later Cure albums, but it's also something that Robert Smith will be heavily criticized for as time goes on.
Yeah, it's kind of strange. This album, like, I'll talk about it more as we talk about the other albums, but it's funny because this album is almost trying to write like pop songs, but not pop songs, because they're very catchy and like everything's pretty pop, like upbeat for the most part, and then it becomes like not. And then it goes back to being poppy. It's hard to explain unless you actually can look at it as a career spanning thing. But other than Foxy Lady on this album, the strangest song to me on this whole thing, I think you can guess it, is the song So What.
Yeah.
That song it's not bad, but man, it is freaking weird.
It's just an odd song. I mean, Robert Smith was on a lot of drugs.
Yeah, did you see how they wrote the lyrics?
Yeah.
He was just reading the back of a sugar packet or something. It's like a cake topping thing or something where he was reading the instructions, and I looked up the lyrics, and it actually says like, you can order this with sending 6 pounds to this place. And I was like, what? Like, it's.
Well, and I think that will go on to show the role of drugs in Robert Smith's writing career, and particularly when we get to talking about Pornography, and their use of LSD throughout the writing of that album.
Yeah, it's I don't know, but so overall, I think this album in particular, I think it's good. I don't know a lot of people who listen to this album, at least like a regular, Cure
I
fans.
don't even know a lot of people who like this album.
That's true. I think that this one, it's definitely one of those ones where it's a love it or hate it.
Definitely.
And I can definitely appreciate it for what it is. I think that the songs are catchy. It's definitely one of those albums that the more I listen, the more it grows on me. But there are times when I just don't lump it in with my mixes, you know what I mean?
Well, here's the way I look at it. If Three Imaginary Boys is not a Cure album, I actually kind of like it.
I could see that, that's...
With the exception of Foxy Lady being on the album.
Yeah,
that was definitely a weird move. Because I almost feel like at that point, like, and perhaps this is my naivety about the music scene in the late 70s, but I feel like by the late 70s, we have moved away from recording labels pushing bands to do covers of classic rock songs.
Yeah. Which
So,
are only like a decade old.
So it's kind of a strange move, and it's often discussed that was pushed by the studio.
Yeah, Chris Perry, right?
Yeah. But it's a strange move on their part.
Mm-hmm.
But you could also talk about how there are some songs on the album that are quite odd and not quite as poppy as the rest of the songs.
Yeah.
And perhaps that was the studio's attempt to maybe try and save what they thought might be a commercial failure.
Yeah. I could agree with that.
I also think, sorry to interrupt.
That's fine.
I kind of think it's not really addressed ever by anyone, but I feel like you can almost look at 17 Seconds as a tactic by The Cure.
Yeah.
Because I don't think if they had recorded that album, they would never have had the career that they have today. And I think that on some level, although Robert Smith talks about how, like, he hated that he didn't have creative control over the album, I think that he played into a little bit of the studio's wants and needs to secure a record that, deal.
Yeah, I could see that. By the way, if one thing we have to address on Three Imaginary Boys is the fact that it's a pink cover with a refrigerator, a lamp, and a vacuum. Like, what's up with that?
Yeah. I mean, I think that just goes to show you that at that point, I felt like The Cure didn't really care what the album cover was.
Yeah. I don't think they had anything to do with it. So.
I don't think they did either. I mean, it doesn't reflect anything remotely like any of their other album covers at all.
Yeah. All right, since this is the first episode of this podcast, it's let you know that we're going to do a segment where we talk about news in the Gothic subculture. And it could be anything from fashion to studies to anything like that.
To movies, to music.
Yeah, just in case anything that interests us. And
for the sake of consistency,
yeah,
we're staying with the topic of music today.
Yeah. So the first news story that I want to talk about was Susie Sue of Susie and the Banshees released a new song. And
it's been a long time.
Yeah, it's been about 8 years. So Manta Ray, her 2007 album was the last time she released an album. I think she's played a few shows since then, but she hasn't really been in the limelight. She showed up at like some fashion things, but nothing really big.
You know what would make people lose their shit? Is if Robert Smith and Susie Sue reunited.
Oh man, that'd be crazy. That would be... I don't even know how people would react to that, actually. It's hard to say. I mean, people want, like... I don't know. It's hard to say what people actually want from The Cure, but that's not what the point of this topic is. So the point of this particular story is that Susie Sue has released a new song for it was the season finale of Hannibal, the show Hannibal, and I guess she was a fan of the show, and the show music guy that came to her and was like, "Hey, we have this show, and we want you to make the song for it." And she wrote a song called I think it's called Love Thing. I think, but talk about it, Robert.
Okay. Well, I think it's interesting that
Love Crime.
Basically
yeah.
had not seen what she was going to be writing a song for at this point.
Yeah.
And went into the studio and wrote a song. But it works out well enough.
Yeah.
Simply because she actually happens to be a fan of the show.
Yeah, I feel like that doesn't really happen that often, you know. And it's unlike Breaking Bad or something like that, which
Exactly.
where a lot of the soundtrack it fits with how insane it is, but that's because they're like, okay, I think they even had an idea of, you know, we're gonna use this song for these kind of segments, where she hadn't seen the scene, she didn't, you know, have any lyrics written. He just said like, here's what it's about love or whatever, and she's like, okay, and then she wrote Love Crime. So
yeah. It's a very odd way of going about writing a song for a movie. And actually, I would almost...
a show.
Oh, yeah, I mean, sorry. A show.
Yeah.
Let's be correct here.
Yeah. You see Netflix? It's this is the way the world's going now.
Well, let's be honest. Netflix is releasing movies. They've just broken them up into episodes.
That's true. That's true. That's a good way to look at it.
But I would say... And I think you can apply this to modern TV shows because it applied to movies in the past, particularly through the 90s and early 2000s, is I felt like a lot of directors almost went about writing their script, having a plot in mind and a soundtrack in mind, already knowing songs that they wanted to use.
Yeah.
And so this is something almost entirely different from that.
Yeah. I can see that. It's like kind of what's that band? Van Halen do that like all the time or something, like write tons of soundtrack songs or something like that?
Yeah. Well, the way I like to look at it is, and I know this is a movie, but I feel like it applies to modern television just because of the way it works, is Garden State. We all know our, our friend Zach Braff is a big music fan. You could call him perhaps the king of hipster music.
I could see that.
But he went into Garden State with the intention of writing a movie around a soundtrack that he had basically already established for years prior. Just using life circumstances and to create the script and plot.
Yeah. Huh. Well, this is the opposite of that.
Exactly.
Yeah. By the way, if you want to know my opinion of the song, I think it's pretty good.
It's actually really good.
Especially for not having released anything in years. It's pretty surprising she kind of can jump back into it that way.
Exactly. And I think that's the hardest part for so many of these artists, particularly bands that break up and their singers that go solo. I mean, you could take the Smiths, for instance, and Morrissey. Like, I don't think, although Morrissey is still popular, I don't think any critics would praise any of his current work.
I don't know. I mean, I liked his, the World Peace, you know the new one.
It's just...
It was, obviously it's not as good as Viva Hate or anything like that, but it was good in its own way. I do think that one thing that hurt that album in particular was the way that the production was handled and the songs aren't, like, you can have songs that maybe aren't as strong as some of your things, but as your other ones, but if you mix them in a unique way, then it can be like, okay, this has its own thing. I felt like that album, like Morrissey's newest album, was unfortunately a little bland. There are good songs, like Istanbul is a great song, but it falls flat because of the way the album is done.
And another thing that many of these artists suffer from as they break away from their bands is that no one wants to hear a Morrissey album. People want to hear a Smiths album. And in the same sense, I think that not a lot of people want to hear a Susie Sue album. They want to hear a Susie and the Banshees album.
I would say that's kind of... I would say that's true in today's world, because people aren't necessarily as focused on solo artists as they once were, because there's so much nostalgia and things like that.
No, exactly.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that because Morrissey has Your Arsenal. That's like one of the best albums ever made.
Yeah.
And that was a popular album, but then today, so many people just listen to the Smiths on the radio. Especially in America where we live. When was the last time you ever heard a Morrissey song on the radio?
Oh God, you just don't. It doesn't happen.
But then you hear the Smiths all the time on the radio.
Exactly.
And I think that kind of is a problem today with, this song may go unnoticed at least years down the line. It's pretty popular now. It's only been out for about 2-3 weeks, and I think that it's going to be pretty relevant at the moment. But yeah, you might end up with the issue that people don't listen to because it's just Susie Sue.
Well, I think what it does have going for it is that it's in a TV show. And actually, right now, a lot of music that's becoming really popular are songs that are soundtracks to current television shows.
Yeah.
And a great example of that is a show like Sons of Anarchy.
Never seen it.
Every song from that show has gone on to become like something that everybody talks about. People post the soundtracks all over YouTube. They're talked about constantly. People can't get enough of the Sons of Anarchy soundtrack.
Yeah. Well, I hope this happens for this song too.
I do, for the sake of Susie Sue.
Yeah.
I would love to see a Susie Sue tour, and maybe this could lead to it.
Oh, that'd be really cool, actually. Yeah.
So that wraps up our news segment.
Yeah, goth news. Goth news, not just news. All right, so that wraps up our news segment, and now we're going to go on to 17 seconds.
17 seconds.
Now, this is really where most people, I would not say this is where most people come into listening to The Cure. I would say that the most common, there's definitely, I talked about it a little bit on the video that I did about Three Imaginary Boys, Grave Gestures. That's the YouTube channel that we post videos on. And I talked about it a little bit in that video, but I really feel like people look at The Cure in different chunks or different eras.
Exactly.
They either are fans of these three, which is 17 Seconds, Faith, and Pornography, which is their gothic rock trilogy. Yeah. They tend to be either fans of Disintegration or Wish. How was the one before that? Kiss Me, Kiss Me, Kiss Me.
Yeah.
And or to a lesser extent, something like Blood Flowers, Cure, or
the ungodly stuff that came after.
Not necessarily ungodly, but definitely not as listened to. I would say that. But songs or albums that are popular at a time and then don't seem to have as much staying power. That's kind of what things fall into with sometimes.
It's what it boils down to, really.
Yeah, and we'll get to those albums, and they're not bad albums, but they're
you could say they're not bad albums.
Well, in their own right, they're good. And
they're different albums.
Yeah, and we'll talk about those a little bit later, and maybe why some people don't appreciate them as much. But we're going to talk about 17 Seconds here, and I really like this album. This was an album that I had heard years after I had listened to The Cure. I had listened to a lot of their, they have so many other albums.
I kind of think that that's the case with most Cure fans, because I feel like people almost get introduced to The Cure with perhaps something like Just Like Heaven or Friday I'm in Love initially, and then when they go...
The iPod songs, right? Yeah.
And then they might go read up on The Cure, and the first real Cure album they listen to is something like Pornography.
Yeah.
But I feel like it's not until they get really in depth with The Cure that people actually will go back and listen to 17 Seconds.
Yeah, and one of the reasons I think that is because this album doesn't really have the single or the hit, or
any hit.
Yeah, it does have the song that is synonymous with them, and it's one of the only songs that they really play off this album a lot, and that's A Forest, and that's played all the time, and you go to goth dance clubs and it'll play, and so there are songs, at least that song has huge staying power in terms of their fan base.
Well, it's funny. If you look up the Wikipedia page for 17 Seconds, A Forest is the only one that has its own dignified page from that album.
Okay, yeah, so that's a very good example of that. And I do like this album a lot, and I was kind of not really into it the first time I heard it, but you kind of have to think of this as a different experience. You're not going into 17 Seconds expecting to dance around the entire time. You're not going in there to hear a whole bunch of catchy pop songs. You're going in, it's almost like a soundtrack album to a movie that doesn't exist.
Well, and a lot of critics actually referred to it as a compilation of soundtracks.
Oh yeah? I didn't know that.
But I think that an important way to look at this album is it's an art album, really.
Mm-hmm.
This is Robert Smith's first venture into creating the art that is The Cure.
Yeah.
And that's the biggest difference between 17 Seconds and Three Imaginary Boys. Is Three Imaginary Boys is a rock band's record, and 17 Seconds it's avant-garde, if I dare say.
Yeah. I think just the whole package is a lot better, and it's it has a definite cohesive sound to the whole album. The whole album, all the guitars sound similar throughout the album.
Well, I think it's important to mention that I think a big part of the consistency of the album is that Robert Smith actually wrote most of the material for the album on 2 separate occasions, writing all the lyrics in those occasions and most of the music just on a Hammond organ in his parents' bedroom because he was so excited and so inspired for this album.
Yeah.
And by the time they got to the studio, they didn't need demo tapes because they already knew the material that they were going to be playing so well. They cut backing tracks, and they spent most of their studio time actually just doing overdubs.
That's pretty cool. And you can hear it in that kind of thing. It feels like it was just a lump of music recorded and written at right around the same time. And that may lead to why a lot of the keyboards and stuff sound similar on all the songs, all the guitars sound similar on all the songs, and all the drums sound similar on all songs. But it's definitely not a bad thing.
No, it's not.
Yeah, it's really good, actually.
I think part of that, too, also is the budget that they were working on. They were working on a 2,000 to 3,000 pound budget, and because of that, they had to be prepared. They had to go in ready to lay down a backing track over which they could do overdubs. And in fact, at one point they were recording 16 to 17 hours a day just so that they could get the album done on time with the money they were given.
Damn, you barely get a band to record for like 2 hours a day.
Right?
So that's pretty crazy.
In fact, they literally ran out of tape on
the final sound.
Yeah. You can hear it on the track.
Yeah.
It was initially planned to be much longer, but they literally ran out of tape at 53 seconds.
Yeah.
And that's where the song ends.
Yeah, I always thought that was so crazy. In fact, that was I think that was probably one of the first songs I actually heard off that album. And I thought it was so weird. Because I was like, oh, the final sound sounds like pretty cool. And it just at the end you could just hear it go vroom, boom, 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 like it just fade, like kind of sputters out.
Yeah.
I was like, oh, that was weird. There's a whole song.
Classic tape just running off the reel.
Yeah. Actually, one of my favorite songs on this album, I know a lot of people love A Forest. I think that song's okay. At least, in my opinion, it's not one of my favorite Cure songs. Actually, In Your House is one of my favorites.
I would actually agree with you. I would say that In Your House is actually my favorite song on the album.
Right? I really, really enjoy that one. And actually, there's on the deluxe edition of this album, there's a live performance of it, and I like that version slightly better.
There's actually a lot of interesting releases on the deluxe edition. The deluxe edition was released in 2005, and we have I'm a Cult Hero released on it, I Dig You, Another Journey by Train, Secrets, 17 Seconds Live in Amsterdam, In Your House Live, 3 alternate studio mix, I Dig You, Cult Hero Live at the Marquee Club, I'm a Cult Hero, also again live at the Marquee Club, The Final Sound, live in France.
Yeah.
All these live tracks that I think that people would really enjoy. So I think that if you're going to listen to 17 Seconds for the first time, I think it's almost worth it to go for the 2005 deluxe edition.
I think it is because you get a lot out of the album. A lot, because unlike a lot of live albums, which, especially nowadays, it just kind of sounds like the album, and you kind of have the same energy on the live tracks that you do on the albums because it's just so produced. I think that it's important to listen to the actual album, the one that was released in the 80s first, obviously, to kind of get a feel for what this album is. And even songs like Secrets and stuff where he's like whispering and everything like that, it's so unique. And but when they play it live, there's an energy there that's not on the actual album. You know, the band kind of works off each other, and the songs are usually a lot faster.
Exactly.
And I just tend to like that.
I feel like the driving force behind the album is actually really the drums, because so many of the guitar parts actually kind of almost sound identical throughout the album.
Yeah.
And I think part of that could be due to the fact that Robert Smith wrote all of this on an organ and then just came into the studio and was basically doing guitar overdubs on a limited time and budget situation.
Yeah. And from what I was actually able to research, because I wanted to look to see if the drums were actually just a drum machine or if they were like somebody actually playing drums. And apparently it's a combination of both.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and you can hear that I was actually confused when I was listening to it, because there were certain hits that sounded like drums and others that sounded like a pad per se.
That's what got me confused, you know, because bands like Sister of Mercy very infamously used drum machines, just drum machines, like First and Last and Always. I'm pretty sure 100% of that is a drum machine.
Yeah.
So I was curious because of the placement of this album, you know, the time, like it's very easy to use drum machines. A lot of people were using just all drum machines and just having a live drummer. And so it's just cool that it's actually a guy too.
No, exactly.
Yeah. It gives it a unique sound, you know?
It definitely does. But I also think it's important to address that this is the first time that I feel like we really hear Robert Smith's guitar sound show up on an album.
Oh, yeah.
Because it's definitely not present on Three Imaginary Boys.
Oh, no. It has... on Three Imaginary Boys, you have like this really shrill, kind of clean sounding guitar with just reverb, and that's pretty much it.
Yeah.
I mean, there may be like a little bit of a chorus effect, but not really. And then the gain, like the distortion on the actual guitar, is so late 70s, it's ridiculous.
No, I completely agree with you. I think the funniest part, though, is that if you were to read the Wikipedia description of this album, they describe it as a record mostly of downbeat tracks, features ambient echoing vocals, and minimally treated instruments, which I feel like is not the case.
That's not really true. No, they use a ton of reverb, like all over the place, and chorus effects, and
flangers, delays, like... The guitars are definitely Robert Smith's guitars, and that's a theme that we will see continue throughout The Cure's career.
Mm-hmm. And we'll talk about that change, because it does change, but... It does. But it's going to where to where we see it, finally, where you cannot hear it on Three Imaginary Boys
at all.
And even the singing, like you can hear where it's going to go.
Exactly.
It's pretty interesting.
And I think that's the biggest reason that Three Imaginary Boys doesn't sound like a Cure album, is because neither the vocals nor the guitar sound anything like The Cure.
Yeah. I agree.
I mean, I would consider Three Imaginary Boys, I'm sorry.
Yeah,
a little bit. Three Imaginary Boys could almost more be considered a new wave album, or maybe even a post-punk album, than
that's usually what people actually that's usually what people actually consider is more like post-punk. And I can see why, but this is like 70 Seconds is like gothic rock. Like,
no, exactly.
Yeah, even though Robert Smith, obviously we said, denies it,
but so does Bauhaus.
Everyone. Okay. So Faith, let's talk about it.
It's definitely an interesting entry into The Cure's career. It's preceded by the single Primary, originally only released on cassette.
Really? I actually didn't know that.
Yeah.
Cassette? But that goes for some money, knowing Cure fans.
Especially today.
Exactly. I think...
for any of you people who know about Burger Records.
Yeah, exactly. It's rare.
Is that a festival coming up, actually? Beach Goth. I'm sure a lot of you might know about.
I didn't want to address that. But yeah, if for those of you who don't know, in Orange County, there's this thing called a Beach Goth, where...
It's essentially created by a bunch of hipsters, where a hipster record label decided that they wanted to bring together 60s psychedelia and goth music into one festival.
Except there's no real goth influence at all.
No, just their style.
Yep. Just that they wear slightly darker clothes
Yes.
that have stupid sayings on them.
In fact, often black Hawaiian T-shirts might be showing up.
Yep. That's pretty much. Okay, so Faith.
Faith.
So primary, I gotta say, so the single primary, I'm gonna say it right out. I think it's my most listened to song on the album. I know, like, you're not supposed to say whenever you're reviewing an album that, oh, the thing I listened to the most was the single from the album, but
I feel like you kind of have to say that for Faith, though.
you know, I don't know. I like a lot of songs on this album. You know, the biggest difference you'll notice right off the bat on this album is that the production is definitely taking a step up, right? So we said that was 17 seconds, right? The production already was a huge change. It was more well thought out.
Well, in fact, they tried several studios in the production of this album. They went from Red Bus to the Roundhouse to Abbey Road. I mean, they tried numbers of studios trying to get the right sound for the album. Their first attempt at recording it, they recorded All Cats Are Gray and Primary, and Robert Smith basically was trying to go for a funereal sound, and he basically agreed that the songs just came out dull.
Yeah, that's unfortunately one of the problems with this album is that it is, and you know, Robert Smith has said it, and a lot of reviewers have said it, is that it kind of drones on, and that there are some pretty freaking good songs. Like, I think that these as songs, these are good songs. Maybe not the best versions of them or the best composition of these songs. Like All Cats Are Gray, that's a good song.
Yeah.
Right? And what's it called? Is it Funeral Party or something like that? These are good songs, and I really like them. Do I like these versions of them, or do I think they could have been better? Probably.
No, I completely agree. And actually, I think that part of the problem with this album is that if we go back and look at 17 Seconds, which is mostly written by Robert Smith, who is on an inspirational, basically, he's on an inspiration trip. Just spends 2 days, you know, writing most of the album. And then we go to Faith, which most of it is written in studio.
Yeah. Yeah, and that makes a huge difference.
It makes a tremendous difference. I'm time and time again, I find myself usually disappointed by albums that were written primarily in the studio.
Yeah, me too, actually, because they just kind of don't have that groove, or they don't have that kind of like natural feeling to them.
Well, I think the biggest problem, and you know, modern producers will disagree because so many albums now are written in the studio.
Like 99% of them, yeah.
But an album is supposed to have a theme, a content. It's supposed to follow a plot. Like, it's supposed to have an arc, a sonic texture to it. And when you write in the studio, you are losing a lot of those things.
Yeah.
Because you don't have the foresight for any of the music that you're making. You are essentially going blindly into a session and hoping that genius strikes you.
Yeah. And
if it doesn't, you kind of end up with an album that sounds like Faith.
I would agree. And I'm only agreeing because Robert Smith agrees to some extent. But I think the biggest problem is it's such an in-between album, unfortunately.
It achieved some moderate commercial success. Critics were pretty bored by it.
Yeah. The song Other Voices, if you've ever seen the video for that, it's actually pretty cool, though.
Yeah.
Like Primary and Other Voices videos, they're pretty cool.
Well, actually,
yeah.
I think perhaps maybe the most interesting about Faith is that the instrumental song, Carnage Visors, was used in Simon Gallup's Brothers film. It was like a short film that he did in which he used the song. But The Cure actually used that instead of having an opening band. They would play that like prior to their set at all their shows.
Well, Carnage Virus isn't really a song. It's like a soundtracky thing.
It's an instrumental piece.
Yeah.
But also that video has essentially disappeared.
I did see a thing a long time ago where it was like like an interview on some show, and they like the host pulls up like a little snippet of it, of the Carnage visors, and they're like, I think they're like, how'd you get that or something like that, because they're the only ones who have a copy of it. So I thought it was pretty interesting.
Yeah, I know.
But that's like the holy grail
of
like Cure stuff. I don't think it'll ever. I mean, if it hasn't come out now, I'm thinking it probably won't ever come out unless he dies or something.
Well, yeah. One thing, it would have to be he dies, or basically he starts running out of money.
I don't think that's gonna happen.
I know, but
yeah.
You never know. I mean, everybody's getting cancer these days.
It's true. That's really, really dark statement, but yeah, that's very true. Oh man. But yeah, so I feel like there isn't as much to say about this one, just because it is kind of samey. It does. The sound improves, right? You get a warmer, fuller sound.
You get better production quality.
Definitely. But it doesn't do dark and moody as well as Pornography. And it doesn't do like the artsy kind of poppy, like at least poppy sounding instruments, like the drums and things like that. It doesn't do that as well as 17 Seconds, but it has definite standout moments like Primary, All Cats Gray, and Funeral Party. Freaking amazing songs. Other Voices, great song.
Yeah.
But yeah, I have to unfortunately agree with a lot of critics and even people who review it today, because I know that because it is an older album, people just like have so much nostalgia and so much love for it, and they just are like, okay, this is part of this trilogy, and so it's amazing. Unfortunately, I feel like it's probably the weakest in the trilogy.
Well, and I mean, that's so true of any trilogy. I mean, you could, whether you're talking about music or movies or books, like there's always a weak segment of the trilogy.
Exactly. And I find 17 Seconds so unique. I find Pornography obviously extremely unique and powerful in its own way. I find this one has some good songs, and it's pretty okay at what it tries, but it's not like, I'm not blown away in the same way.
I get what you're saying. I do appreciate, though, that this is the first time that we see the 6-string bass appear on a Cure album.
Yeah,
which is
cool.
Definitely a big part of the Cure sound.
Yeah, that's pretty awesome, actually.
Yeah. And that just goes to show you that they are, at this point, maybe they didn't go into this, with the right songs or, the right mindset, but they are thinking about production quality now. They are thinking about how can we improve the sound. They are thinking about what can we do to change things, what can we do to be interesting. They are pushing themselves in new directions, and I think this is ultimately what makes Secure so interesting, is how drastically and they evolve across the span of their career.
Yeah, I agree. So listen to it, make up your own mind about it, but yeah, they get stronger albums. This isn't a bad one. Like, this is obviously
it's not a bad album. I think we should say that it's not a bad album.
It isn't. But I just feel like it's could have been stronger.
It's lackluster.
Yeah, and that's hard to say in a weird way. But it's like one of those things. Like we said earlier, grading it on the scale of The Cure, it isn't as good as it could have been.
Exactly.
Maybe if they just remix it one day, I'll love it. Like maybe if they just do that, but or remix it again, because I've heard the remastered one. But maybe if they just kind of adjust it a little bit, it'll end up being my favorite.
Yeah, but so many remasters turn out terrible.
I know, it's true. It's not bad. It's almost just louder, but yeah.
That's usually what happens. They just make it louder and try and clean things up.
Exactly. So yeah, that's
It's very rare that you have a true remix of an album.
Oh, we're going to get to that when we do Sisters of Mercy.
Yeah.
Oh, my gosh. There's, like, one that's so good. Like, they remaster it. No, we'll get to that later. But, yeah. There are some that are really good. So, that was Faith. All right, so Pornography. Let's talk about Pornography, Robert. Let's get really in deep with Pornography.
Let's get into Pornography. Like, let's just put ourselves inside it.
Yeah, but before that, let's talk about the next Cure album.
All right. So Pornography is the fourth studio album by The Cure, released in 1982. I think it's important to mention that at this point, The Cure is consistently releasing an album each year.
Yeah, every single year, 79 through 82. I mean, that's crazy. I couldn't do that. No way. But yeah, Pornography, I think, is a great step in a really good direction. Now, I know we said just a second ago that Faith was disappointing in a lot of ways, and that is really because of this album.
It's true. I feel like Pornography is the album that Smith was trying to make with Faith, but he couldn't accomplish.
Exactly. I would totally agree with that. This album has a very rich, full sound to it. It's obviously not very upbeat.
Oh, definitely not.
And don't expect that. Like this is one of the reasons I think with this album being as popular as it is, because it's definitely, I think, the most popular out of the three.
Maybe like as far as like critical review goes, it's definitely the most popular of their career. Like,
yeah, at least today.
Yeah.
Because I think it got pretty negative reviews when it came out, but today it's definitely the most popularly reviewed of 17 Seconds of Faith and this. And I think that's actually why a lot of people don't go back and listen to the other album, 17 Seconds of Faith, because a lot of people tend to listen to, Kiss Me, Kiss Me, Kiss Me,
exactly.
or Disintegration. They go back to, like, okay, what's the other most popular Cure album? And a lot of, other than, obviously, like Wish or something like that.
Yeah.
But this is often on those lists of, like, if it's not number one, it's usually number two.
Yeah.
And I feel like a lot of people are like, whoa, this has, like, not really any hits or anything like that, and it's not...
No, not at all. In fact, I think the only thing that you really call a pop song in the album is maybe A Strange Day.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And this album does actually have a music video to it. Actually, it's, well, kind of too. So it has A Hanging Garden has one. If anybody's ever seen that video, it's just very 1982.
We'd also be surprised if you've seen it.
Yeah, at least if you live in America and you've seen it. Because in America, the Cure, I'm just going to talk about this really quick, is that if you live in America, the Cure's videos are actually extremely hard to watch, at least at this moment in the U.S. And so a lot of people don't actually associate a lot of their 80s music videos or their early videos with them because I think because of legal rights or something like that, they aren't on YouTube, most of them. I think Primary is, and a edit of Boys Don't Cry, but I mean, 10:15 Saturday Night is not easy to find, or at least in good quality.
Yeah.
A Forest, you can't find that on YouTube currently. It keeps getting put up and taken down. The actual official video, there actually is an official video for Forest that a lot of people don't know. Other Voices has a video. Charlotte Sometimes has a video, and A Hanging Garden has a video, and they're not super easy to find in America, even online, which is crazy to think in today's world.
It's more than they're not easy to find. Like, you have to go out of your way to find these albums.
Yeah.
Like,
in fact,
these music videos. Sorry, I apologize for saying albums.
Yeah. But even some of the later videos, which, from Wish even, I forget, there's just some song that has a video, and it's really hard to find. I don't know why. I'm assuming it's that somebody owns the rights to it, because
that's usually how these things work. I mean, it's the same reason that you can't find any content by Prince on YouTube. Like,
yeah. So I just want to say that A Hanging Garden has a video, and so does Charlotte Sometimes. And Charlotte Sometimes could be on this album, but it's actually its own single that was released before the album.
Yeah.
Just so people know, because Primary came out before Faith, but it's on Faith.
Yeah.
But Charlotte Sometimes came out and is not on this album, unless you buy I think the remastered one with the expanded tracks has it.
Exactly.
But it has like 30 tracks.
Yeah.
Extra. It's funny because I think that Charlotte Sometimes, released before the album, is actually poppier in a sense than most of the other stuff on the album. But that's not to say that the stuff on there isn't great, because Pornography is I'm going to excuse my language, but it's a fucking great album.
I hate throwing out the word masterpiece on any kind of podcast, but it really is. It's their magnum opus.
It is. It's great. And because of the fact that it is so uncompromising, it's just somebody's vision of music, and it's just done really well. Everything that they did before us is leading up to it, where they got the drum sound right, they have the vocal sound right, they have the guitar sound right, and they would actually pretty much continue a lot of those similar things. Like the guitar sound would be pretty much the same thing, only in a major key instead of a minor key. They would have very, driving bass sounds, and they would have kind of, that be pushed to the forefront.
And a big thing on this album is just how much production goes into it and how many tracks there are on each individual song. Robert Smith is quoted as saying that he wanted it to be the ultimate intense album, and that they deliberately did not throw away anything that they recorded.
That's pretty cool. Like that, and I think that gives it its unique sound.
I agree. And I also think it's important to note that I think I really do believe producers play a big role in the way an album turns out. And this is the first album at which they use Phil Thornalley to produce the album.
Yeah.
Which they had not with the previous two.
Yeah. Was it Chris Perry or something on the first one or the second one or something like that? Yeah. And God, I'm just really surprised by this. I mean, I was the first time I heard it. In fact, I'm gonna be honest. I didn't like this album the first time I heard it.
Yeah.
I'm going to be really honest, because I was coming from, Disintegration. And I was like one of those people where I was kind of looking up their older stuff, and this album is depressing.
Definitely.
But it's depressing. Like, if I could see why a lot of people who are depressed or have, kind of battle sadness or something like that, this makes them feel really good.
Yeah.
This album is a very downbeat album with a lot of sorrow, a lot of heartbreak, a lot of pain.
Well, Robert Smith talks about, during the process of this album, 1981 to 1982, he talks about how he was in such a dark place in his mind that he basically said he had two choices. Either this album was going to get recorded or he was going to die. Yeah.
And, there's a few people who say things like that. Like, I know that Billy Corgan of Smashing Pumpkins has said a similar statement with, Siamese Dream, where he's like, I was living in the studio and, I don't know.
Well, the ironic thing about that is that The Cure was living in the studio during the recording of this album to save money on production.
Well, there you go. So, kind of similar situation. So, when people get to that point, I could see how they create something great, because that's the only thing they can see. That's it. I was probably all he did every single day, all day.
And it's also important to note that with how great an album this is, it's kind of surprising that it was actually made. I mean, given everything that was going on in the band, they were fighting at the time. They were loaded 90% of the time.
Yeah.
Robert Smith talks about openly how they were constantly on LSD and just always drunk. He said that they would show up sometime around 8 in the morning and leave sometime around 3 in a very strange frame of mind, looking very odd, and people gave them weird looks.
Yeah, that doesn't surprise me in the slightest. I think it does have the album does have a weird, almost psychedelia feel in some parts, at least with the amount of reverb and the way the vocals are treated and things like that, especially the actual song Pornography with
and the delays, phasers,
the kind of soundscapey things and sound effects that they add in there. And it's
without an album like this, shoegazing probably wouldn't ever have existed.
I would say it definitely helped. And it's funny because even on the next album, the top, they go way psychedelic. And so I think it's cool that you get to see some hint of it here.
They also go much poppier on their next album as well.
Oh yeah.
And I partially attribute that to, they have two members of their band leave after this album.
Yeah.
That is
the one where Simon Gallup leaves, right?
Yeah, Simon Gallup leaves. I believe also
the drummer or something.
Yeah, their drummer, he leaves as well. And that's anytime you change, two core members of your band, your sound is going to change dramatically.
Oh yeah, by far. And I gotta say, I know a lot of people are really disappointed they never really made an album like this again. You know, they definitely did downbeat tracks.
Yeah.
Like, and almost every single album has downbeat tracks. I mean, even Wild Mood Swings has downbeat tracks.
Yeah.
And I think that, you know, he explains, you know, I didn't want to do the same thing over again, you know, and I didn't want to repeat it or things like that, or he just felt he had to do something different. And, you know, kind of started moving more towards Love Cats and things like that. And,
Exactly.
And I can understand that, because this is basically the perfect final piece to the puzzle of this gothic rock trilogy.
Oh,
Like,
exactly.
it really is, because you have a very loose album like 17 Seconds where it's much more like a soundtrack. You have, you know, with each song becoming like, you know, it's like, oh, this one's instrumental, this one's the slow one, this one's the actual, you know, songs are very segmented.
Very.
But it makes a soundtrack. That's why people call it soundtrack, because it feels like it has different acts.
Yeah.
And then you have Faith, which is moving.
It's in the ballpark of the Cure's gothic sound.
Yeah, and it's trying to work on production a little bit more, trying to make it a little warmer of the sound and a little more driving, but not quite getting there. And then you have Pornography, which is basically the combination of both those things with great production and a more specific idea. And so you get an album that has a very distinct sound through every song and feels like a complete work. This has very emotional songs.
It's written with driving passion. I mean...
Yeah, it's just great. And I know that's super cheesy to say, but it really is. Like, whenever you sit down and listen to this album and you kind of learn a little bit more about it, like, it's not only relatable, which is a very hard thing to do with whenever you're doing music like this. You know, it's very easy to hear songs that say, oh, you know, like, I forget what the first line is. The first line's like super, super depressing. It's like, but it's very hard to, look up that line for me. It's the first line. But it's very hard to make music like that relatable in some way, because a lot of times people are like, oh god, this is like so cheesy, it's like, it's so whatever. And I don't really hear people say that this album is like some 80s cheese fest of sappiness, you know? I feel like people...
Definitely not.
Yeah. I feel like people talk about, you know, how the other albums may be that way, you know, songs like Catch, where it's like, you know, sometimes you used to try and catch her, but I never even caught her name, you know, which obviously are more poppy. And I don't hear that kind of criticism.
Yeah, that first line, it doesn't matter if we all die.
Yeah, exactly, right? So the first line of the album is, it doesn't matter if we all die. It kind of reminds me of Typo Negative's, their first album, what's it called, the Slow, Deep, and Hard. The last lyrics on the album are, suicide is self-expression. It kind of reminds me of that in a weird way, and that's a good thing, because Typo Negative I love.
And I will say, like, out of this trilogy, this is the first time when I put, like, their gothic albums on, like, that I get excited, like, really and truly. Like, I'll admit, like, I'm not a big fan of 100 Years.
Yeah.
Like, I kind of think
Them's
that song
words, man.
suffers on on the album. Yeah, you know, and all of that comes down to personal taste. But I think songs like Short Term Effect are great.
That's a great
Hanging
song.
Garden are great.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and Siamese Twins is good. Cold is like the epitome of like their gothic sound.
Oh, yeah.
Like, you couldn't get possibly any more gothic
Absolutely.
than Cold.
And I'd agree with that, actually. You know, I think that there's a ton of strong material on here, and you can pretty much go in depth on all these things, but I think the most important thing is that, like, this album feels like an album. It doesn't feel like a whole bunch of segmented songs, like, you know, like the other albums had felt like in a weird way, where it's like these songs are distanced from one another. This all comes together. In
a weird way, this feels like, and, you know, a lot of times bands will have this first debut album, and it's like, it's their, you know, their album that they're always known for. And, you know, obviously that's not the case for The Cure, but this feels like that debut album. It feels like The Cure have arrived.
Yeah, exactly. And it's too bad Simon had to leave right after this. But yeah, a few things I want to talk about. after talking about pornography, or kind of in conclusion of at least this podcast, at least this episode, is Stu already mentioned the music video thing. One thing I did want to mention is the Cure's image and its development. So
Exactly.
a lot of people obviously associate the Cure with big hair, pale makeup, lipstick.
The quote-unquote anti-image that they are associated with,
Yeah.
which Robert Smith hates.
Yeah, exactly. They associate very much with goth. They wear all black and things
Mhm.
like that. And he said, that's just how I dress, right? But when they started out, that's not how they looked. Like,
Yeah.
he pretty much just looked like a normal guy, wearing
They just look like a post-punk band.
Yeah,
like,
wearing blue shirt and
Yeah.
red pants for their promotional appearances and stuff and photos. And
he just looked like an average dude from that time in the typical fashion of that era. Like,
and so, there wasn't makeup or anything like that.
no, definitely not.
And especially not with the first album, and like I said, even the cover for the album is weird. But then you go to 17 Seconds, you see like a little bit of it, in the
Mhm.
music video for Forest, they're wearing black and it's kind of spooky in a
Yeah.
forest, and
by
it's-
faith, they're making kind of like a...
yeah, it's starting to wear makeup and then like, the cherry red lipstick and
Yeah.
things like that, and starting to get the slightly bigger hair and,
Mhm.
and all that. But then by Pornography, it's like the huge step into where, you could see them looking like that.
Exactly.
They have the teased hair. Even though it's shorter, it's not as like gigantic as it gets.
Yeah.
But, they're wearing makeup and eyeliner and all those things. And,
Yeah.
And black,
And to use my line again, it really is the arrival of the Cure
Yeah.
in both their sound and their image.
Exactly. And so I thought that was kind of important to mention, especially for a band that is known for their fashion, is that this was really where probably most people would begin to recognize them.
Exactly. And I think with a lot of gothic bands or goth associated bands, fashion is such a big important thing to talk about.
Yeah, I'll look at Bauhaus. I mean, that's a huge example of that, where Peter Murphy even like did modeling.
Yeah.
So it's something that adds to it.
Exactly. Like if punk is all about trying not to be fashionable, goth is its opposite in that goth is trying to take fashion to extremes.
Yeah,
Like,
it's trying to use the fashion to kind of enhance the music.
exactly.
Whereas, and you can say that about some punk music, obviously
perhaps some of
it they prioritize the fashion over the music
Yeah.
in punk. Whereas with goth, I feel like there is some kind of link between the two, obviously, like fashion and the music.
exactly.
But I think that sometimes the music is a little more complicated than punk.
Yeah.
That's all I'll say about that.
I'll say the same about the fashion as well.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's yeah, so I guess next time we're going to get into some interesting territory with the Cure. We're going to see the Cure become what most people know the Cure to be. So we're going to cover probably the rest of the 80s Cure.
We're going to see the same Cure, the same image, the same amount of production and orchestration, but we're not going to see something nearly as gothic. If anything, they're going to start moving towards new wave and pop music.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you're going to see that as early as literally the next album, which takes place 2 years later. It's going to be the top in 1984, and it's going to be very interesting. You have anything else you want to say, Robert?
I think that pretty much wraps it up. And I think part of the reason that these albums can really be considered a trilogy and the reason that they build so well together is the fact that they were released consecutively year after year. And again, we'll talk about this again in the next podcast. But obviously, like, there is a break between Pornography and their next album.
Yeah. So we'll get into the next time. I am Dr. Sanders.
This is Robbie Gore.
And this has been episode 1 of GothCast.
Thank you.